Hello, travelers. Welcome to Reach the World's Explorer program. For over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens through virtual exchange. My name is Tim, and I'm so glad you're joining us for today's live stream event. Today, we're continuing our exploration of the world of modern maps. I'm very pleased to welcome Koya Brown, an urban geographer and a solution engineer at Esri. Koya is here to help us better understand mission-driven mapping, which, as she described it, is taking a concern and putting it on a map by asking a question. And today, Koya is going to show us exactly what that means, and we're so happy to have her. If you haven't already read Koya's wonderful article on the Reach the World Virtual Exchange website, we'll add a link in the chat bar today so you can see that. And if you're just joining us and want to reserve your classroom's place on this virtual exchange expedition, we can add the registration link to the chat bar as well. Finally, I want to give a special welcome to the teachers and students who are joining us live today. Please feel free to use the YouTube chat bar to let us know you're here, where you're joining from, and of course, to share any questions you have for Koya as we go. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 30 minutes. All right, it's time to explore the world of modern mapping. Koya, welcome to Reach the World.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Koya. I am a solution engineer, but I like to call myself an urban geographer because that's where I train. So that means that I like cities and I like location. And I try to put that together to sort of solve problems. I'm going to share my screen. So my focus was mission-driven mapping, and I've loved this. I've been with mission-driven type of mapping throughout my career. And so how I see it is really sort of looking at a concern. I chose the Uprooted as my article because I was able to connect with it through my personal experiences. And that's one of the things we don't really get to see about maps is that they're not just about location, sort of political boundaries. Oh, this is a state, this is a country, and then here's the world. It's more like, hey, people have lived experiences in these places. There's these things called place-based geographies, and we can really start to tell a story. So when I saw the Uprooted, what really resonated with me was a story that I heard from my family about how they left Eritrea and then made it to the United States. And I had these visuals in my mind of I made up everything because I wasn't on that journey, but this really brought it to life. This was actually targeted for Syrians, and what happened in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, so around 2011. But it really told the story in a very human way. I was able to see the images. So when I saw these images, I really saw my family. I saw people of different ages. I saw children all leaving. So when my family left Eritrea, they were seeking asylum because of political warfare. Then they told me they had to sleep. They walked for about 3 or 4 weeks and they had to sleep in different places. So this image was like, oh, so this is a camp, a refugee camp. I never really painted the sleeping conditions like this, but it brought it to life. I was able to sort of connect with the story of my family. We add charts. So these maps are very interactive. So we can look at these in chart form, which is very common. And we can look at them in maps. So this is the refugees in 2014 by region. You can see Eritrea, Somalia, sort of this East African, Ethiopia. So my family, they walked from Eritrea to Sudan. Just going to scroll through this. And so what stood out for me is that these people went all over the world. My family went all over the world. Some ended up in Sweden, some ended up in Germany, some ended up in Italy, Canada, and then later on into the US as they made their journey, their migration. So we're able to see this. Then I'll go to what's really good about this is that it paints the story. So this really paints the story about what civil war looks like and how it tears apart a nation. I never really thought about it when my family used to talk about when the war broke out, what that could look like. I've never experienced that in the US except for 9/11. But some countries experience it all the time. Another thing that stood out is that my grandmother is Muslim, and So when I saw it coming out of like Syria and these Middle Eastern folks, and it resonated with me in terms of like religion and people fleeing because of just warfare. And we can see a lot of these images. So one of the things is like the exodus into Europe really stood out is because that was one of the first places after the long journey of my family, they landed in Italy. And to think about like sort of some of the narratives of people in boats, people just jumping into waters. During this time, there was a lot of stories of children dying in the waters as they tried to make it to shore, some of them being stuck between borders. So um, it just really I was really able to connect with this story, and that's one of the reasons why. So one of the things that this map does, this well, is that now maps have the ability to offer space to donate or volunteer to support different causes. So this map goes through the story, but the mission here is really to donate and to volunteer to help the transition across the globe. So I'll pause here and I'll transition into another map. So I mentioned that I was in transportation. So as a solution engineer, I try to solve problems for transportation. One common one is in public transit. So I also help the Racial Equity Unified team. And so when I speak to this in public transit, this really becomes an equity problem for me. So when we think about public transit, if we think about taking buses or subways, and we think about the people that they serve and the sort of questions of access to, so access to jobs, education, so schools, shopping, maybe hospitals or parks, so to these what I call non-work destinations. And we can start to figure out who's underserved by our transit system and who can, has access to get a job accessibility. So this story map goes through three questions. One is, who does my transit system serve? How well are they being served? So level of service, and how easily can people access important destinations? So those important destinations really start to shape healthy outcomes for communities. So I'll start here. So the first question is who my transit system serves. So one of the first things we're able to do is we're able to put transit stops, so bus stops, onto a map as well as their routes. So the routes are in color and these little white dots are the stops. We can start to think about these in terms of what are the demographics that are in these areas. Are they, in African American communities? Are they in Chinese communities? Do more areas get more stops than others? So we can look at, where are our transit stops and our transit lines? We can look at where are the areas being served. So we really start to look at service areas. This is important because what you see is you start to see these gaps. These gaps are areas that aren't going to be covered by your transit system. So folks in those areas really won't know, really won't have resources to get to some destinations. We use some little techniques called buffers. So we build like these edges. You can see that they're smooth. But if we don't stop there, we take it a step further. Sometimes we do these circle buffers, but they really don't tell us how well we can service. So if you see the circle and you see the gray area, there's a gap between these two. What we really want to start to look at is the gray area. The gray area really tells us who's being served. We can see these little buildings. And so these areas that are in dark are areas that aren't being served by our public transit. So maybe folks have to walk. We can see the overlay here between the buffer and then a service area. So service areas are just ways for us to better assess how we service our communities and who we're serving. Let's go to the second question. How well are people being served? So these areas in these bright green are areas that have more access. So they have more number of stops in these areas. Not sure, but all of this is focused in the Atlanta area. So this is actually looking at MARTA system. So now we can look at the frequency of the MARTA stops. In this case, these bright green areas have more stops than these darker areas. So we can see that the city center has more access in specific times of day or overall as a way to get to work, to get to school, than other areas in Atlanta. So let's go to the third question, is how easily can people access these destinations? So if we look at here, these bright green areas are highly accessible during sort of a 30-minute transit time. But now, where does our transit system go? If we start from the city center, we can see that the green areas is about a 15-minute walk. And then we add the transit stops. They really can't, in actuality, really can't go that far in our transit system. Now we add the walk time plus the transit system, accessibility expands. So they're able to get to more destinations for shopping, access to healthy foods if there's food insecurity or if they live in a food desert. And then time of day matters. So what you have access to changes depending on the time of day. And so with that, I'll stop here and transition back.
That is so interesting. I'm really struck as someone who doesn't see a lot of story maps, how different a story map is from a map that students are probably used to using in their classrooms. Koya, can you talk about just like the format of a story map? Why does this format help with mission-driven mapping more than just like there? I mean, when you were going through both of those examples, there were a handful of things that I saw in there that looked like an actual map to me, in my understanding of like a map with countries and places or cities and stops located. But there's so much more on that map. There's text and there's charts and there are other things that help you really understand the story.
Yes. So one of the most powerful things about story maps is you're able to create a narrative. So you have these maps. So we're looking at sort of these web-based maps. So these ones that you create. So it's very similar to a traditional map. And you do have places and things. So you have sort of your legend, you have streets, identifiable streets, and then you overlay sort of your concern. So in this case, we're looking at these bright areas are really who's getting served. But when you put it inside of a story map, you're able to put a story around it. You're able to create a narrative. So in this case, the narrative that we're doing for our mission is public transit and how well are people being served? What's their level of service? So how frequently are stops in their area? But in the Uprooted, it has a narrative, but it's a very different narrative. The narrative is about refugees, people being forcibly displaced from their homes. So you're able to use maps and leverage them in a much different way. So you can tell your story. So it's not just looking at points and lines on a map. You're able to add some words and to use the graphics to sort of tell you, hey, here's, these many people were relocated. So it just adds a much more powerful story to your map.
Okay, yeah, you had said that mission-driven mapping is about asking questions, and you showed us several examples of questions that you asked through these maps that helped us sort of better understand the topic you were exploring. For kids who are looking at these maps thinking, wow, this is really cool, I would love to make my own story map, what makes a good question? Are there certain aspects of a really good question that is best answered through a mission-driven map?
I think so. So I think it's more than just where are. So when we start to think about space or geography or maps, we think about where. So if we wanted to identify, in my case, all Black women or all African American women, that's a question. It's like, where are they? So what you would do is you would take that, and it's very simple. You would find some data, and you would map all Black women, that particular topic, and you would be able to see them. But when you start to ask questions about systems or processes or experiences, that's when it becomes much more powerful. So you might ask, So maybe in your neighborhood, you have more sidewalks or you have more concrete or different structures. So you're just like, oh, uh, why do we have more impervious surfaces? So what that allows you to do is to add different elements. So not only do you need to know where the impervious surfaces are, but you also need to understand why things were built. And so those allow you to add more maps. So you're able to sort of think through all of the processes.
Okay, yeah. You have, I know that you're a solutions engineer at Esri, and you also said you're an urban geographer. What is your daily life like in that role? Like, what do you do during your average day at work?
My kids would say I sit on meetings all day. um, I listen to to calls. So what I do is I interact with customers, and what I do is I listen for technical problems, and I try to understand how we can solve them with a map, and what's the best approach for that, to sort of help support any of their initiatives or the amazing work that they already do. It's really what I do.
Okay, and what is it about cities and the geography of cities that drew you in or made you become an urban geographer versus some other kind of geographer?
It was really about urban formation. So in the US, our cities are designed much differently than most of the world. And I wanted to understand poverty, and why it was concentrated in certain places. And so to understand that, I was like, oh, the built environment. I understood as oh, you have these big buildings. They're really pretty. They're destinations for tourists. But why are they there? And I wanted to understand those questions of really poverty and place.
Okay, yeah, it seems like the examples you've given of mission-driven maps tackle very like complex topics. I mean,
Yeah.
is mission-driven mapping best suited for things that are very complex topics or are very hard to see just with your eye? Like you have to, it really works best when you're bringing all of this data and photos and resources together to show something really complicated in a clearer light.
I was interested. It's funny that you said that. I see mission-driven mapping as almost research because at one, like where you're able to explore a question, but you have to really, really define that question. And in your research, so when you're going to look for things, you can pull up all of these other ancillary things. But a mission could be as simple as what I refer to as a sort of to and from, so destination. So like I want to go from school to home. That's a mission, and then we can expand our missions. Like maybe I smell something along the way that may be air pollution, and maybe I want to understand like what is that. You can do that because it happens in a particular place. So maybe my neighborhood is hotter than other places, so that would be something like an urban heat island. So it doesn't have to be super complex, unless you want to make it super complex and have a whole research project out of it. But it just depends on what you want to understand. It's like how you see the world and what you want to ask of it.
Yeah, that brings us really nicely into something else you wrote in your article about the beginner's mind.
Yeah.
Through at Reach the World, we talk a lot about the explorer mindset, which is
Uh-huh.
curiosity about the world around you. And I saw a lot of connections between the explorer's mindset and the beginner's mind. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more about the beginner's mind.
Yeah, so the beginner's mind is something I took from a yogi practice. So I'm a yogi, I do yoga. And really, what it is about is being able to see the world as it is, being able to see everything. So you bring this mindset. It's like, hey, I don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And not having all the answers allows you to find different things, right? You're able to explore. You're able to sort of ask questions and be curious, and it's okay. So one of the things I like to understand is sometimes we go into different things like we're scared to fail. And it's like, but failing is okay because you can learn from it. And failing faster, um, you can recover from it and you can explore more. it's a concept in business of failure. Nobody likes to talk about failure, but stumbling blocks, things that you hit roads. You're like, oh, I don't get it. It's really hard. But if we go ahead and say, hey, that's really hard, maybe we say, hey, that's a barrier. Maybe I need to understand that a bit more. And that beginner's mind allows you to do that. Because if you come in with all the answers, how are you going to understand anything? You already have all the answers.
Yeah, and for that reason, kids can make fantastic geographers
Yeah.
and make their own story maps, because as you're learning about new things, you don't have a lot of preconceived notions about them. You can approach it fresh. So for all the kids who are listening and who think Koya's job sounds really cool, like I do, and you see something that you want to make your own story map about, go for it. Koya, are there resources that kids can use to make their own story maps if they have a question that they want to explore?
They do. So there's this thing we love, and it really walks you through how to basically do the uprooted. Whatever was some of the elements of it. Maybe I can socialize a link, and there are resources.
Okay, yeah. If you maybe if you could send me one afterwards, I'll add it to the chat, and we can share it with the group so kids can start their own project if they're so inspired this summer.
That'll be hot.
You also in your article mentioned a project that you did with some K through 12 students where they were looking at house values. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, yes. So I'm a GeoMentor, which means like I like to go around schools and implement GIS and basically create a lab or some sort of study. I worked with some students at Inman Middle School in Atlanta, and they wanted to look at gentrification. I mean, that's a big word. I was like, what?
Yeah.
What? But it came out of them noticing changes in their school, sort of the people changing, the streets changing on their journey to school. Sort of like the streets being cleaner, houses being built, and some students leaving. And they were more of the Black and Brown students that were leaving the schools, and so their school was changing. And they was like, "What is this? What am I experiencing?" And so what they wanted to know is like, "Oh, why are these houses way more expensive than these houses over here?" And so they really wanted to look at it, and so they looked at the housing values, and they said, "Wow, these houses just across the street are 700,000 and a million, and these are like 200, 150." And they really couldn't process it. So they wanted to process it. And they found the word gentrification. It's like, oh my goodness, our neighborhoods are being gentrified and we're watching it. And they did it through like taking pictures and making maps and asking the questions, basically, are African Americans being pushed out of their homes?
Yeah, I think that's such a good example of kids starting with something they could see and witness with their own eyes, and were curious to know if it was something bigger or the bigger story. And mission-driven mapping really, especially if you go to the article, Koya shared some great images of the maps that the students created to sort of plot their data and show through maps and other ways what they were experiencing as students in the neighborhood. That was a really neat project, and I hope it's an inspiration to other students who are watching today and notice something and are curious about something in their neighborhood or their town or wherever you are, and you could make a map out of it. Koya, what are some skills or interests that most people who get into your line of work have? Like if I was a student who thought maybe I could be an urban geographer, what should I study? What kind of interests would I probably have?
Ugh, that's a tough one. Oh, and I just want to add before we answer that is that every student I have worked with that did a mapping project for school have gotten A's. So if you need, just add that there.
Hey, if I was a teacher and I saw one of those beautiful story maps, I would give you an A too. So
yeah.
yeah.
So some of the interests. So what I'm finding is that a lot of the folks in my field, once you start to go technical, you start to be sort of introverts, talkative introverts, which means you're really kind of to yourself, but you can talk a lot about a specific topic. But other than that, you're kind of like to yourself. one of the ways that I got into this space was through a NASA research project and a National Institutes of Health research project. And it started out with just like mapping. So I started out in research, asking questions again, and this was on urban heat islands. So what I found overall is that a lot of times when you first start off in this space, you end up being more environmental, or you start looking at landscapes and rocks and stuff. And then it's like, well, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in people. So I was always interested in people, in understanding um, really poverty. I actually had a thing where I just wanted to like fight poverty all over the world. And I was like, well, how do you make money from that? I was like, is that a job? So I went into urban geography.
Okay. Yeah, it's you in the midst of that, you brought up another really fascinating point that people often see geography as just places, but it can very much be people, as you've shown us time and time again through your article and through this conversation, that if you're interested in people and you like people and you want to help people, those are all missions that are achievable, or at least can be helped with a good map. As one of your colleagues said a couple weeks ago, that maps are used to make decisions. And if you can create a really compelling case for banded transportation in Atlanta, for example, through a map, you can make a lot of positive change. I know most of your work you do for clients, and you help them solve their missions or approach their missions. As an urban geographer, is there a question that you've just got that you're burning to answer? Like what would be your next thing that you would love to explore through a mission-driven map?
Racist zoning. So I get to work with a lot of teams, but one of the things I want to understand is, can zoning be racist? So can investments in neighborhoods foster poverty, foster lack of healthy communities? When I first started, I did, my research has always been, it's been geography, it's been business, and then it's been super technical. So mine's, I like write code and I like to do, all the boring stuff. But honestly, if you could write code, you make more money. And that was like one of the things, like, well, I got to make money. So I decided to write code. One of my first questions was looking at federal policies. So federal policies, housing policies specifically, that basically created these things called housing projects. So housing for lower income folks, and then why it was all concentrated. But then I was like, how come HIV/AIDS rates are higher in these concentrated neighborhoods? And could federal housing policies sort of create a place-based geography, health geography of HIV and AIDS? So I'd like to extend some of that work and look at, could it be our zoning? So it's still housing stuff. Could zoning sort of create these place-based geographies that create or perpetuate poverty?
Okay, another really big topic to explore. That's good luck with that. Seems like a really great set of questions to find a good answer to. Koya, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you today. I learned a ton about mission-driven mapping, and I'm sure our students did as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank our entire on-camera and live stream audience for the amazing questions. There's a lot more to explore within the world of modern mapping. Please be sure to visit the expedition homepage. You can read Koya's wonderful article with more pictures from the story maps that she shared today. And you can register to make sure you don't miss a single article or video call with the Esri team. For a complete listing of upcoming Reach the World events, please visit athome.reachtheworld.org. And with that, we'll see you next time. Koya, thank you so much.
Thank you.